Since almost the first time he could talk, Carmen had been warned never to trust humans. His sire had cautioned him countless times, even before the vid reels were filled with news of Priovian and human conflict. "Keep your talons sharp and your venom ripe, son, for humans are not to be trusted." That had been the mantra repeated to him again and again. The vid reel showed humans as depraved to the extreme. Stories of beheading entire clades of captured prisoners and using their skulls as drinking vessels. More than one nightmare in Carmen's youth had been inspired by those pale pink boogeymen, with fangs and the grimaces they seemed to enjoy making. Worse still were the stories of humans bombing repositories of alfalfa pearls, or smashing them directly when found carried by warriors in the wild. Those tales, in particular, always made Carmen clutch his chest, feeling his own alfalfa pearl nestled within the circle of bones and muscles, hidden unless he exerted great and careful effort to release the exquisitely fragile jewel. Trust in the supposed protection of the archives faltered after the bombings and destructions. Carmen's sire retrieved their 2 remaining family pearls from the local repository and told him of lines of other families doing the same. They had only 2 surviving pearls due to an earthquake decades earlier that had severely jostled and partially buried the repository under an avalanche of rock, long before Carmen was born. He marveled as his sire carefully brought home the pearls of his own sire and grandsire, each unique but still carrying a strong blue tone that echoed the colors of his sire's scales and Carmen's own. His sire allowed him to carefully touch and cradle the pearls only a few times. The rest of the time they were kept under the most vigilant protection, nestled in a pearl carrier slung across his sire's torso at all times. That was how Carmen remembered life for many years. He also remembered his sire growing more irate at news of the ground the Priovians were losing in seemingly every conflict. Carmen could sense the hidden despair of his mother, though she shielded him and his younger siblings from it. Occasionally at night, Carmen would sneak to the top of the balcony and hear her worried words to his sire about the possibility of him being called upon to serve, and what it might mean for the family if he did not return. That worry became a reality when the letter arrived, a physical delivery rather than a digital message. Precious coral gilded the envelope, and the message within was laser engraved on a piece of ornamental slate. It called upon Carmen's sire to leverage his experience and serve as a ship commander once more. His sire has shown him pictures of the ship he was to command, a sleek and shining white vessel with a distinct profile among the stars, beautiful and deadly, capable of defeating human vessels 2 or even 3 times its tonnage. Carmen, in his childish understanding and idolization of his sire, could scarcely imagine that any harm could come to such a beautiful and powerful vessel, nor that it could ever falter or fail when being piloted by his beloved parent. Before he left, Carmen's sire entrusted him with his great-grandsire's pearl, keeping his own sire's pearl within his own carrier. He told Carmen, as he carefully tucked the pearl into his child-sized carrier, that protecting it would be the greatest honor he could give the family until his return. Another year passed, and it was a lonely one. Carmen did his best to support his mother, brothers and sisters, studying diligently at the academy and voraciously consuming every piece of news about the ongoing war. Now and then there would be news mentioning his sire's vessel, the Knife of Laurel, recounting skirmishes fought and usually won against the humans. But the humans seemed inevitable, each report claiming fewer victories and more casualties, until updates about the successes and advances ceased entirely, replaced by tallies of the dead. It was one such evening, on the night of the Ruck Feast celebration, as Carmen transferred his great-grandsire's alfalfa pearl to the ceremonial receptacle on their mantle, that the news bled a special broadcast. The entertainment animations his siblings were watching was replaced with visions of fiery debris. To his horror, Carmen recognized the white paneling of his sire's ship amidst the wreckage. His fears were confirmed when the report announced that the Knife of Laurel had been lost after a boarding action with the human fleet. The ship had crashed on an uninhabited moon, its destruction so great that there was little hope for any survivors. The shock of recognizing his sire's ship made Carmen jolt at the worst possible moment, causing his great-grandsire's pearl to slip from his hands. He reached for it desperately, winning his claws to stretch farther, but the pearl fell just beyond his grasp, cracking and shattering into thousands of brilliant, shimmering shards as the hollow stones splintered. His mother, who had been filling feasting bowls, turned at the sound. She let out a keening wail at the sight of the shattered pearl, but as her eyes shifted to the news screen, catching the image of the burning craft, her cry became an agonized scream of true horror and loss. Carmen's breath came ragged as he stared, his vision blurring, watching the ship crumble and burn. The newscaster's voice reported that humans had boarded the Knife of Laurel, daring to tread within it and engage in close combat. Then, suddenly, the voice grew excited, pointing out that escape pods had been detected landing on the moon's surface before the crash. Carmen's mother clung to faint hope, telling him that their sire likely survived within such a pod, safeguarded along with his own sire's pearl. But deep in his chest, Carmen knew it was a fragile hope, one best not dwelled upon. Painful weeks dragged on, until finally word arrived. No crew from the Knife of Laurel had survived. The only survivor across all escape pods was a human who had been captured. One of the messages they received revealed that the captured human had been the second in command of the vessel that had attacked the Knife of Laurel. When an image of the captive was broadcast, Carmen felt a ripple of disgust shiver down his spine at the sight of the ugly creature. The human was denuded on the head, a bald, shining dome of skin, rather than the shaggy keratin mop most of their species displayed. Carmen took it upon himself to memorize the face, inscribing it into his mind as his most hated enemy, knowing this damned human was responsible for his sire's death. 5 years later, Carmen crowed in triumph as the converter station exploded, the unmanned power relay detonating in a massive fireball. The station was one of dozens his government had built as part of the collaborative ceasefire with the humans, a portrayal of everything his sire had fought and died for. The humans had ended up with the edge in numbers, despite their ships being inferior in one-on-one combat. Still, Carmen believed the gap in capability had not justified surrender. Instead of accepting defeat, he had formed a group of like-minded warriors, many of whom had lost family and friends in the war. Together they had carried out several bombing missions in the last cycle, seeking to disrupt and goad the government into action. They wanted to force the kings and queen to recognize that the humans were incapable of providing protection, and that the Alliance demanded far more from their kind than it did from the fleshy, nearly hairless bipeds. As they pulled away into the atmosphere, the proximity scanner began blaring an alarm. Moments ago it had been silent, but now it displayed dozens of ships close enough to obliterate Carmen and his freedom fighters. He could even see the shimmer of the vessels becoming visible against the star-pocked black backdrop of space. Squat, square metal ships, adorned with the garish reds, blues and yellows the humans bafflingly favored, came into view. Carmen scowled in recognition. The cloaking technology, one of the few advantages the human ships had over their own during the war, had not been widely shared with their so-called allies. Rage and grief surged through him as he reached to power up his weapons, prepared to go out in a blaze of fire. But then his sire's words echoed in his mind. "If you must fight for a cause, fight for it. Do not throw your life away. Your life is yours to spend as you see fit, but make sure you spend it well." Carmen powered down his weapons, and saw his compatriots doing the same, as the surrounding human ships moved closer. Half a year passed, with Carmen rotting in his prison quarters. The kings and queen had declared the alliance with the humans their highest priority, and this was reflected in the Judicator's actions, who charged Carmen with permanent imprisonment, the harshest sentence short of execution. Yet Carmen felt his actions were justified. To him, the humans were nothing more than conquerors, and their alliance was mere pretense. Early one morning, his meditations were interrupted by the sharp rap of a prison guard's claws on his door. "You've been nominated. Follow me." Curious what he had been nominated for, Carmen followed, led to a small meeting room where an assembly of judicators awaited him. "Prisoner Carmen, we are here to review your case for possible special consideration for parole," one began. Carmen stared in disbelief. "Parole?" he repeated hoarsely. "That is a human term. I thought my sentence was permanent imprisonment, a consequence I accepted. Do they now wish to punish me with their own methods?" One of the judicators, a stern-faced matriarch, steepled her fingers and sighed, clearly displeased. "This is true, but as part of our cultural exchange with the humans, we have learned that life sentences may sometimes include opportunities for parole in all but the most heinous cases. This would mean you would be released, albeit monitored, and allowed to act and move within society under certain stipulations. Your actions, while significantly deviant and destructive, caused no loss of life and resulted in minimal injuries, a fact noted but not emphasized by your defense." She flipped through a file Carmen recognized as his conviction record. Looking up, she added, "As such, parole may be an option for you. However, there are complicating factors." Another judicator, his voice hoarse but firm, spoke. "Your actions, while not inspiring a rebellion amongst your fellow Peruvians, have still raised humanity's concerns over the sincerity of us having a peaceful alliance. These concerns remain unresolved. Were it solely up to our kind, you would likely continue serving your sentence here, isolated on this prison world." Carmen worked hard to keep his face neutral, masking a mix of satisfaction and unease. Satisfaction at knowing he had proven a thorn in the side of what he viewed as a sacrilegious alliance, but unease at the faint, dangerous flicker of hope. The possibility of seeing his partner and child again, ones he had last seen before the attacks on the stations when he had been captured. He hadn't dared entertain such thoughts until now. A third judicator, a slender figure with a calm demeanor, stood to speak. "What tips the scales in your favor is humanity's request that we try a practice they call rehabilitation." Noting Carmen's confusion, they explained, "It is an effort to meet with prisoners, address their needs and concerns, and prepare them to reintegrate into society." The judicator continued. "Although you have been on this prison world for only half a year, your distance from our people began long before that. Rehabilitation, in their view, is intended to amend such isolation." Years of isolation with his rebel cell, planning, arming themselves, stockpiling weapons and supplies, and avoiding any contact that might compromise their location, had left him estranged and ignorant of the changes of the world at large. At the time, it was scarcely a concern for Carmen, but his frustration at his ignorance was laid bare when a recent prisoner arrival discussed a technological advancement, a skip drive, capable of speeds exponentially exceeding mere light-speed travel. Begrudgingly, he nodded slowly. "I suppose there are some aspects I could improve on," he admitted. "Oh, not just learning aspects of our culture," one of the judicators added, "but also those of the humans." Before Carmen could splutter in disbelief, the first judicator continued. "To this effect, you will be working with a human parole officer." Carmen's scales bristled with suspicion, his thoughts flashing to visions of fighting a human hand-to-hand. But the judicator anticipated his reaction. "Your claws will remain blunted during parole, and the human supervising you is equipped with a continuous supply of anti-venom." Carmen sighed, gritted his fangs, and forced the tense muscles around his venom sacs to relax, as the judicator continued. "To that end, we would like to introduce you to your supervising parole officer." Blunted footsteps echoed from outside, human boots striking the stone floor. As the figure strode into the room, Carmen froze in disbelief, every muscle paralyzed for a moment before fury galvanized him. With a roar, he surged forward, snapping the restraints that bound him. The face before him was unmistakable. The bald human, captain of the vessel that had destroyed the Knife of Laurel. His claws extended, he swung with all the force he could muster. To his shock, the human was far faster than he anticipated. With surprising strength, the human caught Carmen's clawed arm mid-swing, pivoting fluidly. Carmen's momentum carried him past, and he landed heavily on his back. Before he could recover, the human pinned him, expertly locking his limbs in a way that neutralized his strength. "Hiya, Carmen," the human said, thick lips struggling to pronounce the alien tongue. "I've heard a lot about you. Pleased to be working with you." It had only been a week, and already Carmen wanted to thoroughly disembowel and envenomate the thrice-damned human assigned as his parole officer. Captain Shakard, as he called himself, had insisted that Carmen be given the chance to venture to an off-world location, somewhere other than the drab and nearly lifeless prison planet he had been confined to for so many long months. Despite Captain Shakard's relentless cajoling, the process remained fraught with resistance. "Why am I registering simply to travel aboard a ship?" Carmen asked in frustration. "I have read more about these skip drives, and nothing about them suggests they need my name or identifying features to throw me across space faster than any sane being would think necessary." Shakard smirked. "I seem to recall your lot weren't too concerned about passenger manifests. Am I right?" "Manifests? What is this word?" "It's a list of everybody aboard, so when something inevitably goes wrong, we can figure out who's missing." Shakard smiled, earning only an annoyed hiss in response. "If I remember correctly, your size ship, the Knife of Laurel, took some time before they confirmed who was among the dead." Carmen said nothing, but Shakard's words struck a nerve. It had taken months for confirmation, complicated by the scattered escape pods, none of which had yielded Perovian survivors. "I know that time was hard for you," Shakard continued, his tone softening. "Your record shows that's when you first ran away from home and began sabotaging and pirating, right around when the peace accords were signed." Carmen glared at him. "Awfully interested in trivia about your pet project, aren't you?" It was a term he had heard from another prisoner about human fascinations, as pets themselves were an entirely alien concept to the Perovians. "Not quite," Shakard replied, unfazed. "I want to help you get your life back on track." He tapped the stack of forms he'd brought. "Once you sign the transport registration, move on to the occupational request list, and after that, a temporary dwelling license." Carmen frowned, his anger momentarily replaced with confusion. "I figured it'd help to keep your hands busy and get you somewhere more comfortable than a cramped prison cell or apartment to rest at night," Shakard grinned. "On Earth, we have a saying, idle hands, or claws in your case, are the devil's plaything. This should help reduce the mischief you're likely to cause." Carmen tilted his head. "Perhaps, but what is this devil you speak of?" Shakard chuckled. "Oh, sorry. Human reference. Closest analogy for you would be, if I'm remembering your mythology right, Scifi, the evening sun? So yeah, idle claws are Scifi's playthings." Rather than clarifying things, Shakard's explanation only deepened Carmen's confusion. "But Scifi is the eater of all and possessor of the nuclear fire. He doesn't even have claws, just a gaping maw and burning eyes. Anything near him would be incinerated instantly." Shakard awkwardly rubbed the back of his head. Okay. Bad analogy. It just means I'll help keep you out of trouble." "If you say so," Carmen muttered. Carmen sifted through the applications, trying to suppress his growing curiosity. The first option was for a cargo pilot. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it offered plenty of time in the cockpit, a prospect that appealed to him. Flying had always been a joy, second only to the adrenaline rush of bombing runs during sabotage missions. The second option made him grimace, a logistical analytics technician. Shakard chuckled and slid the sheet of scribbable material, what he had called paper, from Carmen's grasp as he saw the sour expression. While Carmen wasn't familiar with this recording medium of paper, he had grudgingly written as clearly as he could using the graphite stick, snapping only a few before figuring out the right amount of pressure to avoid tearing or gouging the surface. "Why would you think I'd be interested in a logistics job?" Carmen asked, glaring at the parole officer. Shakard tapped Carmen's file folder. "Well, You've got a history of coordinating a lot of materials in a very short amount of time during your years in the rebel cell. Very specific, hard-to-get materials, too. There are plenty of companies that would drool at the chance to snap up someone with that kind of skill. Drooling at the chance to snap up and consume me? Carmen said, tilting his head. What? No, I meant... Shakard stammered, thrown off. Carmen allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction at the human's unease. I'll admit, Captain, I take no small pleasure in seeing you unsettled. Shakard chuckled. All right, you've got me. But please, just call me Nolan. Carmen narrowed his eyes. I'll continue to call you Captain, if I even need to address you at all. The anger simmered within him, fueled by the memory of his sire's gleaming ship engulfed in flames. The blurred and grainy image of the human standing before him, the same one who had ordered his destruction, flashed in his mind. Carmen's claws twitched as he wrestled with the urge to threaten or strike Shakard, until his attention was drawn to the third job listing, Dwelling Architect. For a moment his thoughts drifted further back in time. He saw himself as a child, curled in a peltful warmth, sitting beside his sire on his bedpad. Together, they had built a miniature cityscape using blocks and wedges of stone and crystal, a cherished memory from just before his sire's deployment. Why would you think I'd be suited for an architect? Carmen asked. His voice as steady as he could manage, though emotion surged within him, anger at the human mingling with tender reconciliations of his sire. Shakard shrugged, a slight smile tugging at his lips. I don't know. Something just told me it might be a good fit. He paused, then added, Oh, that reminds me. I've got a small gift for you. From his bag, Shakard pulled out a small cardboard box, emblazoned with human writing, and a red square logo in one corner. The box displayed a model of a human-style dwelling module, constructed from tiny blocks made of carbohydrate polymers. There was even a depiction of an atmospheric shuttle that could also be built with the pieces inside instead if the builder so desired. If you're interested, I thought this might catch your eye. Consider it a gift, a gesture to start fresh. Carmen stared at the human, and for the first time, didn't feel the familiar surge of anger. What replaced it wasn't friendliness, but rather an emptiness he couldn't quite define. Quietly, he accepted the box, muttering a low hissing, thanks, before turning back to carefully finish scribing his name and details with the chipped graphite stick. Where are we heading now, Captain Shakard? Carmen asked, making a half-hearted effort to keep the annoyance out of his voice. The shuttle hummed through subspace, the gentle whine of the skip drive behind their seats beginning to grate on his patience. All in good time, Carmen, Shakard replied, reaching forward to pat the parolee on the shoulder. Carmen startled at the gesture, instinctively beginning to hiss before forcibly cutting it off a moment later. I have exams I could be studying for to ensure I receive my certification, he said irritably. Shakard chuckled. Trust me, you'll do fine on those. You're a fine architect. Wasn't it your instructor who said he'd never seen someone pick up the skill so quickly? Carmen grudgingly admitted the human was right. Most of his studying by this point was remedial. The architect position had turned out far better than he'd anticipated, already well on his way to becoming an independent journeyman, and his move into a new apartment had gone smoothly. The space was smaller than he would have liked, especially for entertaining his wife, who had begun visiting again, and bringing their young son. Yet despite the cramped conditions, seeing his family again filled him with elation. His son seemed thrilled to explore the new surroundings and play with his sire, showing little concern for Carmen's long absence, or the new cramped living quarters. In preparation for their next visit, he had purchased a set of stone and crystal building blocks, carved on his homeworld, as well as another box of the same hydrocarbon-connecting bricks Shakard had given him, and eagerly awaited giving the gift to his son when they next met. Staring out at the swirl of stars speeding past the shuttle window, Carmen's curiosity deepened. They'd been travelling far longer than he'd expected. Adding to the mystery, the registration slip he'd been issued and filled out provided no destination, only an encoded string of human text. When the skip drive rumbled and they re-entered real space, Carmen's chest tightened as his eyes locked onto a nearby debris cloud. Among the fragments, he caught sight of a white prow, one that matched the knife of Laryl perfectly. The memory of that burning wreck from the newscasts flooded back in vivid detail. Pressing his face to the window, Carmen drank in every detail of the scene, memorizing and preserving it in his mind. Shakar must have noticed his fixation. "I take it this is the first time you've seen it," Shakar said quietly. Numb, Carmen could only nod, his eyes never leaving the wreckage. Somewhere within that field of debris lay his sire's remains, and perhaps some fragment of his sire's Alphala pearl. Something that, against all hope, was intact enough to be recoverable. Yet to his growing surprise, Shakar didn't slow the shuttle near the debris field. Instead, they continued onward, as a small planetoid loomed larger in their view. Carmen's breath caught. The image was also hauntingly familiar. Blue and purple skies above a planetoid of harsh greys and reds, a dusty surface littered with rocks and scraggly plants, barren and unforgiving. It matched precisely what he had read about as a child, devouring reports in hopes that his sire might have survived. For agonizing days he had clung to the faint dream that one of the escape pods had landed here, and his father had been aboard, allowing them to reunite. Those hopes were crushed when the reports confirmed no survivors, save one, and that survivor now sat in the cockpit beside him. Shakar piloted the shuttle through swirling clouds, the exterior splattered by a brief rainfall. He shifted uncomfortably as the liquid streaked the viewport. Oily stuff, and it itches like hell if you get it on your skin. Not great for drinking directly, but you can distill water from it if you're careful. Carmen nodded, unsure what to say. He vaguely recalled that humans required absurd amounts of liquid compared to most sensible species. The shuttle dipped, weaving between grey rock spires, until Shakar spoke again, his voice quieter. "There it is." Carmen's gaze followed Shakar's gesture to an enormous spire ahead, split in two by some ancient quake or impact. The broken upper half lay nearby, cloaked in dust and scrub. Beside it was a glimmer, something that caught Carmen's eye and sent his heart pounding. His breath quickened, his muscles tensed to the point he feared they might shatter his own pearl. The shuttle descended to land. Emerging onto the planetoid's arid surface, Carmen approached the glimmering object with Shakar close behind. It was one of the escape pods, smashed and battered, but with its crew compartment astonishingly intact. Carmen's eyes darted over its surface, disbelief warring with unease. "That's where we came down," Shakar said, his voice casual as he joined Carmen near the wreck. Carmen's chest tightened. "We? Are you suggesting—" His voice trailed off. Shakar planted his hands on his hips as his eyes scanned the wreckage. "Both of us. Yup. Your old man and I came down in that pod together and survived the crash against all the odds." Carmen turned sharply, his gaze flicking between the escape pod and the human. "You're saying you rescued him? Alive? But he was declared dead. There were no survivors according to the reports." "That's true," Shakar admitted. "I did what I could. He was half dead already. Something on the bridge exploded and he was in bad shape when we hit the ground. I was barely conscious myself after all the venom he pumped into me, before I managed to knock him out and drag him on board." "You dragged him on board?" Carmen's voice was incredulous, disbelieving. Shakar nodded grimly. "Yeah. He even taught me a thing or two about patching wounds, fixing Perovian biology. But there's only so much a body can handle. He passed a few days before your people's recovery teams arrived and took me captive." Carmen stood in silence, emotions churning. Gratitude full with anger. The human had saved his sire's life, even if briefly, but Shakar's kind, and Shakar himself, had also caused his death. And somewhere, a whisper in his mind warned him against trusting humans, echoing words his sire had drilled into him at the war's start. He stepped back, readying his stinger, his muscles tense. He had noticed Shakard no longer carried an anti-venom dispenser, and hadn't for months while interacting with him. Carmen's voice was low, his words edged with anger and suspicion. "How do I know you're telling the truth? What reason would you have to bring me here, to tell me this? To torture me with this knowledge? Is this some sick joke, to satisfy a human urge for sadism?" Shakard's expression softened, his smile faint. He shook his head, his eyes occasionally flicking to the ray stinger, but never lingering or moving into a defensive posture. "Carmen, did you know I asked to be assigned to you? Hell, I practically begged them to let me be your parole officer, and for you to even get that parole offer in the first place." Carmen tilted his head, blinking, his confusion apparent. "Why would you do that for me?" "Well," Shakard began, his tone introspective, "I was lucky enough to have my mum given a similar offer for parole. She turned her life around when I was about half your age." He paused, then added softly, "Besides, I made a promise to someone, to help guide you." "Guide me?" Carmen's voice was skeptical, though a flicker of curiosity shone through. "Yes," Shakard replied. "They were worried you might lose your way. After all, your life is yours to spend as you see fit, but make sure you spend it well. They didn't want you to spend it consumed by anger." Carmen froze, his sire's words echoing in his mind, now spoken by this human. Shakard reached into his pack, and Carmen tensed again, expecting a weapon. Forcing himself to relax, he was surprised when Shakard instead pulled out a small, heavily armored case. The human entered a code on its side, releasing the lock, and then offered the entire case to Carmen. "Here," Shakard said quietly. "Take it. Careful when you open it." Carmen carefully lifted the lid, bracing himself. What he saw inside nearly made him stagger, his hands trembling as he held the case. Inside was an alfalfa pearl, and fragments of another, the broken pearl almost perfectly restored into a sphere. His chest tightened as recognition struck him like a blow. The fragmented pearl belonged to his grandsire. The smoky stripe along its surface was unmistakable. Its restored seam shimmered with golden hues, reflecting light in delicate patterns. "Fragmented pearls are nearly impossible to preserve," Carmen whispered, his voice shaking. "They shatter so easily." "Yup. Certainly took some time to carefully pull it together," the human said with a grimace. Shakard's voice was soft, despite the rush of wind on the barren moon. "That joinery is based on an old human method called kintsugi. It's a technique we use to repair broken items that are still precious to us." Carmen nodded, wordlessly, his gaze drifting to the other pearl, the intact one. Its colors matched his own, ones he had seen when examining his own pearl within his chest. But there, too, was the smoky stripe, a subtle reminder of his grandsire. He knew, without question, this was his sire's pearl. Shakard's voice broke the silence. "He wanted me to give this to you when he thought you were ready. I can't undo the past, Carmen, but I'm hopeful for your future, as was he." Carmen stood frozen for a moment, before managing to whisper, "Thank you, Nolan." Shakard nodded, and together they turned toward the shuttle wreckage. Side by side, they stood in silence, paying their respects to the ghosts of the dead.